There, okay. Sorry about that. I'm a total idiot when electronics is concerned. In May 2019, a protest demonstration marched through downtown Warsaw from the Prime Minister's office to the US Embassy. The route was slightly unusual for Poles, even though they usually find plenty to protest against in the policies of their own government, almost never object to the policies of the government of the United States. This time was different, however. Some 10,000 demonstrators turned out to condemn an act of Congress, number S-447, that then-President Trump had signed into law a year earlier. The act demands that State Department report yearly to Congress on signatories' compliance with the Terezin Declaration on Holocaust-era assets, passed by acclamation in 2009 by all members of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, hence also Poland and the US. Signatories to the Terezin Declaration stated that they, I quote, consider it important where it has not yet been effectively achieved to address the private property claims of Holocaust victims concerning immovable property of former owners. And, quote, note that in some states, hairless property could serve as a basis for addressing the material necessities of needy Holocaust survivors and to ensure ongoing education about the Holocaust, end quote. Seemingly unexceptionable statements, but according to the demonstration organizers, who came from the parliamentary and extra-parliamentary extreme right, combined with Act 447, they amount to a Jewish attempt to illegitimately extort $300 billion US from Poland and hence bankrupt the country. Protesting and opposing it was therefore literally a question of life and death. You can see a placard calling Act 447 unconstitutional robbery and plunder while the national anthem is being played at the demonstration. The Polish government, its protestations notwithstanding, was, according to the protesters, complicit in this criminal attempt, as well as the US administration, hence the route of the march. Both governments were allegedly acting under irresistible Jewish pressure, hence placards with the slogan, "Stop Jewish Occupation," to be understood as Jewish occupation of Poland. But Poland, protesters proclaimed, would prove stronger than others who had caved in earlier, hence the banner that you will see in a moment, which says, in 1995, Switzerland caved in to Jewish pressure. Poland does not intend to. The amount of the alleged Jewish claims, incidentally never sourced, was not only staggering and unjustified, but also immoral, posters claimed. While the US did nothing to help Jews in World War II, do you remember the St. Louis? A banner said, referring, of course, to the ship that was returned back to Europe carrying Jewish refugees who eventually perished in the camps. While Poles gave life for Jews. Do you remember the Ulma family? Another banner said. The Ulmas were one of the Polish families who were murdered by Germans for helping Jews. The logical conclusion, therefore, was take your claims to Berlin. This is not a Polish sin. The organizers were teaching the participants to chant with limited success, but no to claims worked better. The message did go through. While the world had been indifferent to the Jews' fate, the Poles stood up and protected them, at the cost of their lives. Now, the ungrateful survivors are demanding $300 billion from Poland as compensation for wartime losses, even though Germany would have been the correct address. Small wonder that the participant carried a placard that said, "Sephardim are the hyenas of the Holocaust." When asked about the term Sephardim, he answered, "Oh, it simply means Jews." To the uninitiated observer, this claim of the Jews being the hyenas of the Holocaust might appear somewhat surprising. Jews were victims of the Holocaust, while the term hyenas could rather apply to those who benefited from their death. This would include hundreds of thousands of Polish families who took over property, including real estate, remaining after the owners had been murdered. I would, however, refuse to condemn those who took over the properties, known in Polish as pożydowskie, post-Jewish, a term that exists in no other language. In the overwhelming majority, they moved into property whose owners already were dead, probably improving their living situation. And anyway, the Germans had first pick at whatever remained of the property of the victims. What was and remains intolerable is that this mass takeover of property of the genocide victims was never properly acknowledged. And what was criminal was that even in the rare cases in which owners or their heirs survived, they risked death if they tried to reclaim their property, and in many cases found death when the new owners rectified the anomaly of having the bad luck of their Jew surviving. Other people's Jews didn't. This remained in post-war Poland a guilty secret, slowly brought to light in this century only by such historians as Jan Gross, Barbara Engelking, and Jan Grabowski, whom we are privileged to have as speaker today. Their research was conducted and published mainly under liberal governments, which might not have been happy about it, but did not grant themselves the right to comment on academic research, let alone intervene in it. And this dark secret is the reason why, 75 years after the war had ended, the post-Jewish question is still so very much alive in Poland. Posters such as this one, warning residents that their real estate might be returned to legal owners, generated huge anxiety. Yet, for all the fear that potential claims generated, this would not have been enough to send people out on the street if they knew that they are in the wrong. One of the main declared goals of the right-wing populist government, which took over power in 2015, was to do away with what it called the pedagogy of shame, that is, the exposing of the darker chapters of Polish history. This doing away took a radical form. Minister of Education Anna Zalewska declared already in 2016 that she did not know who did the murdering in Jedwabne, a small town in which in 1941, on German inspiration, the Polish inhabitants had slaughtered their Jewish neighbors. The Institute of National Remembrance, already quoted by Jan Grabowski, a somewhat Orwellian institution, which had, however, done groundbreaking work on Jedwabne, made an about-turn. The head of its Office of Public Education, Lublin branch, Mr. Tomasz Panfil, wrote an essay arguing that the situation of Jews in the ghettos, quote, did not look bad, end of quote, compared to the horrible situation of the Poles, and was awarded by Zalewska's ministry the National Education Commission Medal for his work. The government took special pains to condemn the usage of the expression Polish concentration camps. Jan already described the issue of the so-called Holocaust law. But furthermore, the government argued that the very use of the term Polish concentration camp was the result of a sly and protracted German campaign with corrupt Jewish support to shift responsibility for the Shoah on the Poles. Speaking at New York University in April 2019, Prime Minister Morawiecki said,
Germans wisely and smartly started to change this terrible genocide which they have prepared and executed. They started to call the camps which were located in occupied Poland, Polish death camps, Polish concentration camps.
Faced with this dastardly German plot, the government had to introduce the Holocaust law, which still remains in force, although the penal articles were eventually removed in a very mendacious deal struck between two con men, the Polish and the Israeli prime ministers, Morawiecki and Netanyahu, respectively. Morawiecki continued, and this probably explained his general attitude to the issue, when at the 50th anniversary of the anti-Semitic campaign of March '68, which coincidentally happened just 2 months after the Holocaust law was passed, Morawiecki stated explicitly that Poland did not bear any responsibility for that campaign because, I quote, it did not exist at that time. What existed in Polish borders was a communist-governed imposed entity that Poland bears no responsibility for. Poland, therefore, not only did not have any dark pages of history to explore and historical accounts to settle, it was, to the contrary, the innocent victim of slander, whose heroism had been undeservedly unrecognized. Speaking at the New York University, already mentioned, Morawiecki said,
and there is an estimated figure of 300,000 Jews, up to 300,000 Jews who have survived the Holocaust on a broadly defined territory, which was Poland before the Second World War, under German occupation. None of those Jews could have been saved, could be saved, without help of a Pole.
This is obviously a gross untruth. Of the 300,000 survivors that the Prime Minister mentions, 250,000 survived because they found themselves on territories controlled by the Soviet Union. They survived not because they had the help of a Pole, but because mercifully they did not meet any Poles. Of the remaining 50,000, half survived in German camps and prisons where the occupier did not have the time to murder them off, and the remaining estimated 25,000 survived in occupied Poland in hiding, either because of Polish help, and yes, we need to recognize the incredible courage of all the righteous who did help Jews, or in spite of Polish betrayal, and very often both, a far cry from Mazowiecki's toll claim. Nor is it true that, as the Prime Minister says in the same presentation,
I don't know if you know the law which Germans introduced in Poland, which was occupied. All the families who have helped with the leaf of bread, giving the shelter to any Jew, were killed. All the villages were pacified, were completely annihilated.
We know of about 7,000 Polish righteous. The real number was, of course, higher. And we know of approximately 800 Poles who were murdered by Germans for helping Jews. Many others suffered other brutal fates, from incarceration in a concentration camp to beatings or destruction of property, but were not murdered. Mercifully, we do not know of even one village that would have been annihilated by the Germans, as the Prime Minister says, in revenge. Though, of course, it was, given the brutality of the German occupation, an imaginable outcome. Nor was Poland alone in having at the death penalty imposed by the Germans for helping Jews. Such was the situation in all of occupied Eastern Europe and Norway, with the same spotty implementation. Still, a difference in comparison to the markedly less brutal fate that obtained in occupied Western Europe, but hardly the certificate of moral uniqueness the Polish government and much of Polish opinion seems to make of it. Furthermore, Poland, under the occupation, risked death for acts such as diverse as listening to the radio or trading in black market meat, and that did not stop Poles from engaging in them. But once historical facts are simply removed from the equation, the process of making Poland the innocent and slandered victim could continue unfettered. Sadly, the blatant lies uttered by the Prime Minister at New York University remained unchallenged by Professor Joseph Weller, who conducted the interview with him. But even had Poland been an innocent victim, it would not be entitled by fiat to the property of other people, be they Jews or anybody else. Thus, it was necessary to distort not only the historical record of the country against whom claims are being made, but also the nature of those claims. And so restitution became, in the rhetoric of the Polish government, compensation. Apart from having something to do with seized or destroyed property, the two concepts have little in common. Restitution is the obligation to return surviving property to its owner or his heirs. Compensation is money paid out for property criminally seized or destroyed. It is beyond obvious that nobody has a claim to compensation from Poland for World War II losses. The country was a victim of German aggression, had suffered horribly, is in itself entitled to compensation from the aggressor, and has received it. Whether the amount is sufficient and the case closed is a separate issue that need not concern us here. The same is true of Jewish compensation claims on Germany. Anybody claiming of Poland compensation for wartime losses should in fact be sent on to Berlin, as the demonstrators were claimed to chant. But nobody is making such claims. What individual Jewish survivors and their descendants, the issue of communal property having been more or less satisfactorily settled, are demanding from the government in Warsaw is not compensation, but restitution. That is, the return of right of ownership to their surviving real estate, or compensation for it if restitution in nature is for some reason not feasible. But this dual use of the term compensation has enabled the government to make the rhetorical trick of claiming that Jews demand compensation for losses they suffered at the hands of the Germans, and demanding this compensation from other victims of the Germans who, what is more, had risked and lost their lives to save Jews. It would be hard to imagine anything more vile. Hence the self-satisfied moral outrage of the Warsaw Street. And so the invented threat to Poland's financial and moral interests could be repulsed. Speaking at a patriotic picnic a few days before the Warsaw March, ruling party leader Jarosław Kaczyński could state, and I will translate because it is not subtitled in English this time.
I próbuje się jeszcze czegoś więcej. Próbuje się stwierdzić, że Polska ma w związku z II wojną światową jakieś zobowiązania finansowe. Otóż, proszę Państwa, tak, są zobowiązania finansowe wobec Polski i wobec Polaków. A Polska żadnych zobowiązań nie ma.
And even more is attempted, says Kaczyński. An attempt is made to maintain that Poland has some financial obligations connected with the Second World War. And yes, ladies and gentlemen, there are financial commitments connected to the Second World War. They are due to Poland and to the Poles. And Poland has no commitments, both from the viewpoint of the law and from that of elementary morality and decency. It is we who should be paid. It is to us that some west of our border owe tens of billions, hundreds of billions of euro or dollars, maybe even more than $1 billion, but not us. We don't owe anyone anything, end quote. He was seconded by that event by his prime minister, who even raised the ante.
Byliśmy tutaj najbardziej mordowanymi ofiarami w czasie II wojny światowej i nigdy się nie zgodzimy na jakiekolwiek wypłaty dla kogokolwiek z tego powodu.
We were here the most murdered victims during the Second World War, and we will never agree to any payments for anyone for that reason. His Minister of the Interior, Joachim Brudziński, summed it up graphically, speaking on Polish radio. Anyone who creates hysteria and maintains that the government will restitute property to Jewish milieus joins the Kremlin's narrative. Not one Polish zloty will be transferred, end quote. And to make sure that he has been well understood, he made an explicit gesture with both his hands. Thus, the Polish government's position was crystal clear. No money is due, no money will be transferred, the very demand is insulting. It is hardly surprising that the reaction from the Jewish diaspora in Israel was one of outrage. This resembled too closely the biblical verse, "You have murdered and you would inherit," 1 Kings 21:19. Yes, yet already with the passage of the Holocaust law, Jewish and Israeli opinion concentrated on the ostentatious reason for it, that is, references to Polish camps. The law does not mention Polish camps. When during the debate an opposition MP suggested that if the issue is to prevent the usage of the term Polish camps, well, let's make it a criminal offense to speak of Polish camps and drop the matter there. Government refused. However, the alleged truthfulness of the allegation was reacted to in statements by a then leader of the Israeli opposition, Yair Lapid, and in a video produced by a US Jewish foundation. Both repeated with relish, yes, there were Polish concentration camps, where in fact there weren't. The foundation eventually was convinced to withdraw the video, but Lapid stuck to his guns, even though it was found out that he himself had provided false information about the fate of his own grandmother in the Shoah, with the objective of strengthening accusations against Poles. Both the foundation and the politician wanted, having been deeply hurt, to return the hurt, but they only managed to solidify the Jewish bogeyman figure so artfully deployed by the Polish government. The issue of restitution resurfaced again 1 year later during the presidential elections, when government propaganda would insinuate that the opposition challenger, Rafał Trzaskowski, would cave in to Jewish demands. Quote, "How can someone who has even a bit of a Polish soul, Polish heart, and Polish mind say something like that?" Mr. Trzaskowski probably does not have any of that, since he says that we need to talk about this, end quote, said Kaczynski in an interview for ultra-Catholic Radio Maria, but he assured that President Andrzej Duda is a guarantee that Poland will pay nothing, end quote, end quote. "I will never sign a law which would stipulate that we will privilege the inheritance of people of one ethnic group over others. This is not done anywhere in the world," end quote. In other words, murdered Jews are claiming ethnic privilege, but to concede them that, one needs not to be a Pole. Time is running out. Let me come closely to the conclusions. Eventually, an additional law was passed making challenging administrative decisions regarding property impossible. This guaranteed that no Jewish claims can be received, even though the law in itself made sense. It ensured that you cannot challenge administrative decisions after 30 years, and The current owners of the property also had right to legal security. But by then, Polish motivation was seen on the Israeli and diaspora side as mainly anti-Semitic, and Jewish motivation on the Polish side as mainly greedy. 62% of those polled supported the government's position on restitution. The extreme right, all Polish youth, dumped a pile of rubble in front of the Israeli embassy with a placard saying, "This is your property." It's hard to imagine any future Polish government moving away from this position. In public opinion, the idea was simple. The Holocaust enterprise, which is the inscription on the tanker, marked with a Magen David, is simply trying to suck Poland dry. This makes the image of the morally corrupt Jews, proven by their alleged demands for compensation for crimes committed by the Germans, this made this image that Jews are simply greedy, corrupt, and evil quite convincing. Parallel to that, the government made revisions in the way that history was being appraised. Poland's only collaborationist military unit, the Holy Cross Mountains Brigade, which was armed by the Germans, fought alongside Germans, killed Jews, and evacuated with the Germans, was recognized as heroic at a public event. The chief rabbi was invited. He responded that he considers the invitation a personal insult. While Prime Minister Morawiecki assured an Israeli journalist worried about the restitution law that, quote, the law will not punish statements that there had been Polish perpetrators of the Shoah, just as there have been Jewish, Russian, and Ukrainian perpetrators, not only German ones. To be fair, the Prime Minister did not insinuate that the Jews were worse than the Germans. He just believed they all belonged in the same general category. And certainly, Jews did not suffer certainly Jews did not suffer more than the Poles. Janek, your polling data is out of date. According to a poll made in 2021 by the Jagiellonian University, 50% of the Poles believe that Jews and Poles suffered alike in World War II, but only 20% believe that Poles actually suffered more. It is unclear if those 20% are the same as the 1/5 who agree with the statement that, quote, though war is a terrible thing, it is good that as a result there are less Jews in Poland today. This ties into a generally worsening perception of Jews by Poles. While at the turn of the century, the percentage of Poles subscribing to traditional anti-Semitic ideas hovered around 10% and was expected to dwindle and disappear in time, in the 2017 research by the team of Professor Michał Bilewicz, 20% stated that they believe that Jews strive for world domination, 24% blame them for the crucifixion, and 27% believe in ritual murder. It therefore seems very plausible that people so vile would be capable of extorting and slandering their rescuers. Hence the outrage expressed by the Warsaw marchers. The Jews are the hyenas of the Holocaust would then be, in the eyes of the person carrying the placard, not an outrageous slur, but a simple statement of fact, courtesy of government propaganda. Thank you.